Hi, I'm Bruce Benson from Total Education Centre, and today we're going to be talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And we're going to be looking at characters today, and those characters certainly knew how to party in the 20s, so good luck to that. Well, we're back, and although they probably didn't party quite like what you just saw, they certainly did have a good time. I'd like to begin by talking about the narrator of Gatsby, and that's Nick Carraway. Now, Nick is the narrator of the novel, and he's a very interesting narrator because of some of the characteristics that he has. Nick was born and raised in Minnesota, and then he went to Yale. And in the novel, it's referred to as New Haven. The novel begins when Nick moves to New York City because he's the narrator, and of course he has to be there before anything happens, to learn business. And he's come from the Midwest, and he's sort of the honest broker. And he doesn't really fit in with that world at all. But he manages to move into a small house in West Egg next to Gatsby. And Nick is fascinated and completely intrigued by Gatsby and the lifestyle that he has, which is completely and utterly unknown to Nick at this point in his life. He hears about Gatsby's reputation, and while he's at his cousin Daisy's, and he finds out later, and of course we find out later, that that's the great love story that Gatsby is developed on. When Nick is invited to one of Gatsby's parties, he's determined to meet his host, and he's desperate to meet Gatsby, and he does, and they become close and they become friends. And Gatsby uses Nick to get back into the world of Daisy, and develop a relationship between Tom and Daisy himself so he can win Daisy back. Nick is not a dominant character in the text. He's sort of the innocent bystander, and he just gets carried along with the events by these rich, wealthy, and highly egotistical characters in many ways. Because the story is told from Nick's point of view, the reader needs to remember that they're only being told one side of the story, although Nick seems to me to be quite an honest broker in that sort of sense. While Nick comments early in the novel he's inclined to reserve all judgments, the reader should always keep in mind that he is the character that is narrating the story, and we need to look at what he does. A couple of interesting quotes for you from Nick that might help you with your study. He says right at the start, "I'm inclined to reserve all judgments." And he says also, "I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited." So that shows us he's a little bit perceptive. And near the end he becomes a little bit more jaded and certainly wiser about the events in the novel and what's happened in that novel. And he says, "I've had enough of all of them for one day," and suddenly that included Jordan too. And as the novel progresses and moves on, he becomes more and more wary of what they're like. And he eventually says, "They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back to their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made." So that's Nick Carraway. But I think probably the most impressive character isn't Nick in the novel, and it's of course Jay Gatsby. And we all know that The Great Gatsby's named after Jay Gatsby. So he's the sort of protagonist of the novel in the sense that he carries the action through his mystery, and the whole concept of Gatsby himself is one of the idea of the American dream and how it can be manipulated and turned. But more on that when we talk about themes. Gatsby's sort of a self-made man who is hopelessly optimistic and romantic about life and his love for Daisy Buchanan. He's the epitome of hope in many ways, a man who lived and died in the American dream, wealthy but never really part of the culture. Gatsby's really romantic and mysterious, and he brings with him that sense of intrigue that those people lack in their lives, and that's what makes him so popular. He's actually from North Dakota, the son of very unsuccessful parents who went to war and then made a great deal of money in mysterious ways. He tries to be part of Daisy's world. He can't recreate the past, and this causes the tension in the novel. Nick says they're a rotten crowd, Gatsby. You're worth far more than all of them, and it's probably true. Gatsby always wanted to be more than he was, and he sort of lives the lifestyles of the rich and famous in the old TV phrase. But it's hollow and he doesn't have the thing that he wants most, and that's love. He does little peculiarity things like calls people old sport and just things that make him a little bit kinkily unique in many ways. He's mysterious about his personal life. In the end, the American dream's over when he's murdered by George Wilson. That's probably not a plot spoiler unless you haven't read the book. And if you haven't read the book, you probably need to read that last section. He's got nothing to do. All he's doing is protecting Daisy. And George thinks that it's he who's murdered his wife and run her down, when in fact that's not true. It's a win for the cynical. It's a win for everything we don't like about the world. And no one comes to Gatsby's funeral in the end. All his friends have abandoned him once his money and wealth is gone. And I think that's the point Fitzgerald tries to make in the text. Now, when we look at Gatsby, probably a couple of quotes that would help you look at him. He says, "It was testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired that there were whispers about him from those who had found little that was necessary to whisper about in this world." And finally, Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. Everything's about Daisy in many ways for Gatsby. He builds his wealth to find love, and he doesn't get it. And I think that's the cynical take on it that Fitzgerald wants us to think. But I'll talk more about that later. The next character I'd like to look at, of course, is Daisy Buchanan. I think Daisy is the love interest in it, but she's a very sort of cynical person. Married to Tom, she's spoiled, she's jaded, but she's extremely attractive and very much fun. She had a romance with Gatsby 5 or 6 years previously, and begins to relive it again, but it's doomed for failure because she's been married to Tom and she has become that cynical, jaded young lady. She considers herself sophisticated, but she's never really allowed life to live life in the expectations that she had when she was young. She says, "I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything." And Gatsby says her voice is full of money, but what happens is she's careless about life and she's careless about Gatsby. She's careless about his love. She plays the socialite extremely well, and Daisy's true character is revealed in chapter 7 when she chooses Tom over Gatsby and allows Gatsby to take the blame for Myrtle's death, even though she's driving the car. She uses a daughter, and what tells us about her lack of morality and ethical nature and how she treats the world is how she uses a daughter as like a disposable little doll in many ways and lets the nurse look after her rather than she's done. Daisy's outwardly beautiful, but has very little depth and very little to credit her for. Her main feature is that Gatsby loves her. Her husband, Tom, isn't a very nice person. He's extremely wealthy, comes from a family of old money, but he's arrogant and is a bully. Tom demands a particular moral standard from the people around him, and yet he doesn't have that moral standard himself. He's hypocritical in many ways. He doesn't see there's anything wrong with his affair with Myrtle. However, when he suspects Gatsby and Daisy seeing each other, he forces a major confrontation. He says he loves Daisy, and he probably does in his own particular way. He's not a likeable character, and we move on. Probably the final character I want to talk about in any depth is Jordan Baker. And Jordan sort of has a bit of a relationship with Nick. Jordan's Daisy's friend, and for a time in the novel, Nick and Jordan are seeing each other. She's a competitive golfer, but also very superficial and a cheat. She's dishonest. She often bends the truth, and Nick doesn't like this quality in her. And I think she fits in perfectly into their world because she is so superficial. The Wilsons are probably the final pair, and we'll deal with them, the pair. Myrtle Wilson wants more out of life than her husband can give her. He is a mechanic. He has a very drab existence. He doesn't live anywhere near them. She's living her version of the American dream by sleeping with Tom and enjoying that taste of wealth that she'll never get in a husband. She doesn't fit into their world. She will never fit into their world. She just doesn't understand they're being used. And I think she represents a lot of the characters in the text and the fact that they're broken in some particular way. And much like Fitzgerald was in France, that he's a sort of broken human being as well, and he captures that feeling very well. I think you'll find, except for Nick, that all the characters are probably deeply flawed in many ways. And this is what makes the novel work so successfully, is that they aren't the perfect heroic figures. That's all we'll talk about with characters. And probably next lecture I'm going to deal with the themes in Great Gatsby, and we'll have a look at some of the ideas in that. So for now, goodbye, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hi, I'm Bruce Patterson from Total Education Centre, and I hope you're really enjoying this series on The Great Gatsby. Don't forget, for further information, have a look at our website. You'll find some wonderful things, and you'll have as much a good time as we are. Cheers to you.